Rain poured relentlessly that night, drenching the small town of Blackwood, Maine, in a curtain of gray, icy water. For decades, Blackwood had been a peaceful place, barely noticed except by the rare traveler passing through in summer to sample Mrs. Margaret's famous blueberry pie or to browse the town's strange old antique shops. But tonight, everything was different. The wind howled with a mournful, endless cry, threading its way through every crevice of the old Moonrise Inn, a hotel once famed in the region. Back in the 1920s. At the front desk, Karen Foster struggled to process a late check-in for two unfamiliar guests. Karen, 26, her blonde hair tied back haphazardly, blue eyes tinged always with a distant sadness, looked exhausted. The newcomers were Mark and Julia Robertson, a married couple from Boston, stopping over for the night on their way to Bangor. Julia clung nervously to her husband's arm, her gaze flicking warily around the hotel's dim hallway. The atmosphere was too still, too oppressive, the yellow glow from the antique wall lamps casting warped shadows across the stained wallpaper. Corinne handed them the key to room 203 with a reassuring smile, but her eyes flicked up the staircase, a deep, shadowy well that led into utter darkness. The couple ascended, the only sounds echoing back being their own footsteps between the walls. Julia shivered, an icy sensation crawling up her spine. She glanced back. For a split second, she was certain she saw someone standing at the end of the hall, a blurred silhouette frozen in place, staring directly at them. She gripped Mark's arm tighter, but when he turned, the hallway was empty, just shadow and silence, as though nothing had ever been there. Room 203 was spacious but aged, the furnishings unchanged for generations, the heavy wooden beds draped in faded floral quilts, a grandfather clock on the wall ticking out a slow, ominous rhythm. Each tick sounded like a warning, intensifying the sense of dread. Julia stood silently by the window, gazing into the churning, storm-black sky. Lightning flashed repeatedly, illuminating the small yard behind the hotel where she saw, in one harsh instant, a figure standing unmoving in the rain, water pouring down his shoulders. The man tilted his head back, eyes bulging toward her window. Mouth stretched in a silent scream, but the storm swallowed every sound. Julia recoiled, yanking the curtain shut, her heart racing in her chest. She considered waking Mark but found him already asleep, worn out from a day behind the wheel. Meanwhile, at the front desk, Corinne had put her book aside, fighting off another wave of boredom. She yawned and was startled by a loud crash from the hotel's basement. She'd heard odd noises from down there before, but this was different, sharper, heavier, unmistakably threatening, like something massive had fallen. Karen hesitated, fear warring with the sense of duty, before finally picking up her flashlight and heading for the basement door. The narrow beam of light barely cut the blackness as she crept down the stairs, each step creaking with ghostly protest. The basement air was much colder, thick with the stench of mold and rust. Corinne searched for the source of the sound, but found nothing out of place except for crates coated in decades of dust. Turning to leave, she heard it, the faintest whisper, like breath against her ear, echoing from a darkened corner. She swung her flashlight. Its beam landed on a wall scrawled with nearly dry, dark red letters. "We are still here." Karen stumbled backward, heart hammering. Her heel struck something soft. She turned and froze in terror. A battered old doll lay at her feet, its eyes wide and glassy, mouth cracked into a grotesque, twisted grin, its porcelain face spider-webbed with fractures. Karen scrambled to her feet, bolted up the stairs, only to have the door slam shut above her with a thunderous bang, the lock snapping shut from the outside. She pounded the door, screaming for help, but only empty echoes replied. In that moment, she realized she wasn't alone in the freezing dark. Something was coming for her, something ancient, angry, and unspeakably cold. Its breath brushed the back of her neck, and a raspy, inhuman whisper curled around her ear. "Welcome home." Karen was paralyzed, unable to scream again. Her trembling fingers fumbled for the wall, clawing at the stone in utter darkness. The flashlight rolled across the ground, casting a feeble spinning glow in the far corner. A shape, not quite human, materialized at the edge of the light, dense, heavy as mist, yet somehow impossibly solid. It stood motionless, eyes as hollow as black holes, mouth gaping like the gate to hell. It drifted closer without a sound, each chill wave washing over her, freezing her blood. In that stretched, suffocating instant, Karen understood this was not a ghost, not a person, but a living memory of agony and dread, conjured and fed by every soul the basement had claimed. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying, whispering for her mother, but the shadow only crept closer. It leaned in, its cold breath numbing her skin. The world compressed to black and white, all sound collapsing into silence. Then the entity shrieked, a deafening, bone-shattering screech that shattered the air. Karen dropped to the ground, her head cracking hard against stone, consciousness spinning away into darkness, haunted by a chorus of screams and weeping that seemed to echo from the bottom of eternity. Upstairs, Julia awoke from a nightmare, drenched in sweat, throat constricted as if invisible hands were wrapped around it. Mark slept on, but his face was twisted in pain, locked in some private torment. Julia sat up, listening. The rain had lessened, but the wind still clawed at the window, moaning like a lost soul. From the hallway came slow, heavy footsteps, dragging along the warped floorboards, steady, unhurried, deliberate. Julia's heart lurched. She checked the time. It was well past midnight. In her mind, she saw again the figure in the yard, eyes blank and mouth open, staring up at her window. She drew the blanket up to her chin and held her breath. The footsteps stopped outside room 203. Julia stared at the door. The latch rattled. Then the door creaked open a fraction, just enough for a single staring eye to peer inside. Julia could not move, her eyes wide and wild. Outside, a voice whispered her name, stretched and ragged, as if pulled through centuries of pain. "Julia, Julia." The sound burrowed under her skin, each syllable laced with horror. She shook Mark awake. Desperate. He woke groggy and confused, but when he looked at the door, there was nothing, just darkness. The door closed as if no one had ever been there. They did not sleep again. Julia clung to Mark, heart pounding. Suddenly, the room's phone shrilled. Slicing through the quiet, Julia hesitated, then picked up. On the other end, a tangle of breathless gasps and frantic whispers, almost impossible to decipher. She made out just one sentence. "Run, before it's too late." Then only static, then silence. Mark and Julia stared at each other, faces bloodless, panic mounting. The cold seeped up from the floor, draining all warmth from the room. In the corridor, lights flickered, then died. Everything was swallowed by blackness. In the darkness, Julia heard the sound of a child crying, a pitiful, echoing wail rising from the basement, overlapping voices, pleading as if countless lost souls were begging for release. Mark stood up, silent and glassy-eyed, as if in a trance. He opened the door and stepped into the darkness. Julia, terrified, followed, calling his name, but Mark was too strong, pulling her along toward the staircase. Down they went, into the pitch-black depths. In the basement, Julia's phone flashlight flickered. In its unsteady glow, she saw Karen, sprawled unconscious on the floor, the broken doll beside her, the wall streaked with bloody words. Mark stumbled further, drawn toward a rusty old iron door, thick with cobwebs and dried blood. The sound of children crying grew louder, a chorus of anguish, so fierce it threatened to tear the walls apart. The horror peaked. The iron door groaned. Open. Inside, a narrow room lined with gouged walls, claw marks everywhere. In the center, a rusted bed. Upon it, A small figure sat hunched, hair tangled, face hidden. Mark stepped closer. The figure raised its head, a face drained of all color, eyeless black pits, a grin split wide to the ears. Julia screamed, yanking Mark back, but her legs felt frozen to the floor. Small, bony, icy hands erupted from the ground, clutching her. Ankles, dozens, hundreds, pulling her down. The room filled with shrieking laughter, with wailing and wind screaming through the broken door, a mad, hellish symphony. Julia fought desperately, watching Mark dragged away into the darkness, his screams smothered by a tide of ghostly hands. Silence fell, implacable. Julia collapsed, fingers scraping the frozen floor, tears and blood mingling beneath her. The nightmare was only beginning in Blackwood, where the line between living and dead, real and imagined, was vanishing beneath. A mountain of forgotten sins. Beneath the weight of unearthly silence, Julia lay trembling on the freezing basement floor, her mind teetering on the edge of collapse. The icy fingers clutching her ankles slowly retreated, dissolving into wisps of shadow, but the memory of their grip burned into her skin, a reminder that nothing in this place could be trusted, not even the darkness itself. Somewhere in the distance, the wailing of unseen children faded, replaced by a sickening, rhythmic thud like the beating of a massive heart buried deep beneath the hotel. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she crawled toward Karen's motionless body, her hands slick with sweat and blood, her heart thundering with primal fear. Karen's eyes fluttered open, wild and unfocused, her lips trembling with half-formed words. "We're not alone," she whispered, her voice cracked and haunted. Julia shook her, desperate for any sense of reality. Karen clutched Julia's wrist, nails digging in. "Don't let it see you," she hissed, her gaze darting to the corners where the shadows pooled thickest. "It feeds on fear. Don't let it see you afraid." Julia staggered to her feet, pulling Karen up with her. Together, they stumbled toward the stairs, guided only by the faint glimmer from Julia's dying phone. The air thickened with every step, each breath harder than the last, as if the hotel itself resented their escape. Halfway up the stairs, a guttural moan rolled through the gloom, so deep and unnatural it made their bones vibrate. They froze, paralyzed by the certainty that something monstrous waited just beyond the edge of their vision. With trembling hands, Julia forced herself forward, dragging Karen behind her. At the top of the stairs, the basement door was ajar, swinging gently as if beckoning them to cross back into the world of the living. But as they slipped through, the hallway on the first floor was no longer the familiar, if eerie, corridor of faded wallpaper and flickering lights. Now it was warped, impossibly long, lined with doors that hadn't existed before, each one painted a different shade of darkness. Whispers slithered out from under the doors, voices full of secrets and threats, promising pain, promising oblivion. Mark was gone. Julia called his name, her voice barely a thread, but only the whispers replied, laughing, mocking, imitating her until it seemed 100 Julias called out in chorus. Her panic swelled, threatening to consume her, but Karen squeezed her hand, anchoring her to this terrible reality. "Don't answer them," Karen said, her voice steadier now. "If you answer, you belong to them." The hotel shuddered, a deep tremor rippling through its foundation. The lights blinked to life for a heartbeat, revealing the true horror of the corridor. Faces pressed against the frosted glass of every door, eyes wide with endless hunger, mouths open in silent screams, fingers clawing at the panes. Blood seeped from beneath the doors, trickling in lazy streams across the warped floor, pooling around their feet. Julia stifled a sob, fighting the urge to collapse. At the end of the corridor, a single door stood open, spilling golden light into the shadows. Julia and Karen moved toward it, driven less by hope than by the primal instinct to flee what was behind them. The open door led into what appeared to be the hotel's ballroom, a place of faded grandeur. Dust swirled in the shafts of light, and old tables and chairs stood in crooked rows, as if waiting for a party that would never come. At the far end of the room, a huge mirror dominated the wall, its surface smeared and cracked, reflecting not the present, but images of the past. Smiling guests in evening wear, laughter frozen on their faces, all oblivious to the darkness that crept along the edges of their celebration. Karen stared at the mirror, entranced, her lips parting in horror. "That's them," she whispered. "They never left. They're trapped, reliving their last night over and over." Julia approached the mirror, her own reflection twisted and strange. A pale imitation of herself, eyes too wide, mouth turned down in a perpetual mask of dread. As she stared, the scene in the glass shifted. The happy crowd faded, replaced by chaos. Tables overturned, glasses shattered, crimson stains blossoming on white tablecloths, figures writhing in agony as unseen hands dragged them away into darkness. Screams echoed from the depths of the mirror, urgent, hopeless. Julia tried to look away, but the mirror held her gaze, its pull irresistible. Suddenly, the ballroom lights snapped off, plunging them into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow all sound. The only illumination came from the mirror itself, now shining with a sickly, pulsing light. Shadows spilled from its surface, thickening and coalescing into shapes that crawled across the floor, reaching for Julia and Karen with grasping, fingerless hands. The air turned foul, the scent of rot and old sorrow pressing in from all sides. Karen screamed, grabbing Julia and pulling her away from the mirror's grasp. They ran, stumbling over broken chairs and twisted furniture, chased by the mirror's hungry glow. As they fled back into the corridor, the doors along the hall began to shake violently, something on the other side desperate to break free. The building groaned, its bones aching with the strain of holding back centuries of suffering. At the far end of the hallway, the old freight elevator's doors were open, lit from within by a cold, sterile light. With nowhere else to go, Julia and Karen hurled themselves inside, jabbing at the buttons, praying the elevator would take them anywhere but here. The doors slammed shut, and the elevator lurched into motion, descending deeper into the earth. As it dropped, the lights inside flickered, illuminating the scratched metal walls, etched with names, hundreds of names, some scrawled in childish letters, others gouged deep by desperate hands. Julia traced a trembling finger over one. Eleanor Marsh, 1932. Karen pointed to another. Henry Wilcox, 1967. The realization dawned cold and cruel. These were not just names. They were the hotel's victims, cataloged and remembered by the very place that had consumed them. The elevator shuddered to a stop, doors opening onto a place that should not have existed. They stepped out into an endless underground corridor lined with ancient brick, the air heavy with the weight of forgotten years. Shadows pooled along the edges, moving independently of any light, alive with malicious intent. Julia's phone flickered and died, plunging them into darkness once again. In that stifling black, they heard Mark's voice, faint and broken, calling their names from far ahead. Julia surged forward, hope flaring in her chest despite everything. Karen hesitated, pulling her back. "It's not him," she warned. "It wants us to follow. Don't trust what you hear." But Julia could not resist, her love for Mark overwhelming every warning. She broke into a run, Karen struggling to keep pace. The corridor twisted and turned, growing narrower and colder with every step. The walls began to close in, brick scraping against their shoulders, the air thickening until each breath was a battle. Finally, they burst into a chamber at the corridor's end, lit by the faint glow of phosphorescent mold. Mark was there, or what remained of him, his body battered and pale, eyes glassy and unfocused. He reached out to Julia, fingers trembling. For a heartbeat, She saw her husband as he had been, warm, alive, loving. But as she drew closer, his features melted, twisting into the same empty, eyeless visage she'd seen in the basement. His mouth split into that terrible, endless grin, and his voice poured out in a dozen overlapping tones. "Stay with me, Julia. Stay forever." Behind her, Karen screamed as the chamber's walls began to bleed, thick, tar-like fluid seeping from every crack. The floor buckled and split, and ghostly children rose from the depths, their faces blank, their hands reaching. Julia tried to drag Karen away, but the children swarmed over them, their cold bodies pinning them to the ground. A wind howled through the chamber, carrying with it the voices of every soul the hotel had ever claimed. The walls buckled, the ceiling collapsed, and the world dissolved into chaos screams, laughter, the terrible sucking darkness pulling them under. And then silence. Absolute, unbroken, unending. Somewhere far above, the Moonrise Inn still stood, its silhouette stark against the lightning-laced sky. But beneath its ancient timbers and crumbling stone, Julia drifted through a world that seemed at once endless and suffocatingly close, suspended in a sea of pitch-black memory. There was no up, no down, just the slow, inescapable sinking through layers of fear and forgotten sorrow. At first, there was nothing but cold, her body numb, her mind caught in the limbo between nightmare and waking. Then, gradually sounds began to seep in, whispers first, then low sobs, then frantic pleading echoing off invisible walls. Julia opened her eyes. She was lying in a corridor that seemed impossibly long, lined on either side with doors, each one identical and marked with a number she didn't recognize. The floor beneath her was warped and uneven, as if the building itself had been stretched and twisted by decades of restless spirits. She sat up, pain blooming in her chest and legs, and called out for Karen, her voice so small it vanished into the hush. For a moment, she thought she was alone, until a faint movement caught her eye. Karen, pale and shaken but alive, crawled out from the shadows, eyes wide with terror. They clung to each other, the warmth of their bodies the only thing keeping despair at bay. All around them, the corridor pulsed with a sickly heartbeat, and from behind the doors came the ceaseless murmur of the trapped. Sometimes it was a name, repeated over and over, sometimes a single word, help, mercy, why? Sometimes nothing but wet, rattling breaths that seemed to vibrate with the weight of centuries. Julia forced herself to her feet, dragging Karen up beside her. "We have to keep moving," she whispered, even though she didn't know where to go or what direction led to escape. They limped down the corridor, flinching at every whisper, every rattling doorknob. The further they went, the colder it grew, until frost crept up the walls and their breath clouded in front of them. Halfway down, a door slammed open with a crash that echoed endlessly. A figure lurched into the corridor, a man, gaunt and wild-eyed, dressed in the rags of what might have once been a hotel uniform. His skin was stretched tight over his skull, and where his hand should have been were nothing but shadowy claws. He stared at them, eyes bottomless, lips pulled back in a rictus of terror and rage. "Don't stop," he hissed, voice like a blade scraping glass. "If you stop, it finds you. If you answer, it takes you." Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, the man was gone, vanishing into one of the endless doors, leaving only the echo of his warning. Julia gripped Karen's hand tighter. They hurried on, now almost running. The corridor twisted under their feet, sometimes splitting into two, sometimes merging again in impossible ways. Their fear built with every step, as did the sense that something massive and hungry was stalking them from just out of sight. Shadows crawled along the ceiling, swirling into monstrous shapes, reaching down with clawed fingers that scraped at their hair and shoulders. They rounded a corner and found themselves in what had once been the hotel's grand dining room. The tables were set for a feast, but every place was occupied by a mannequin, dressed in fine 1920s attire, faces painted with smiles that were chipped and running with streaks of black. As Julia and Corinne entered, every mannequin's head snapped toward them with a sickening crack, the painted smiles stretching wider, glass eyes fixed and hungry. The lights above flickered, and in the stuttering illumination, the mannequins began to move. Some rose jerkily to their feet. Others dragged themselves across the floor, arms outstretched. Their laughter was hollow, mechanical, echoing off the walls in waves that battered Julia's mind. She screamed, grabbing a chair and hurling it through a window, but the window only revealed more darkness, deeper and thicker than before. Corinne pulled her away, and together they ran through the nightmare dining room, pursued by the mannequins, their wooden hands clacking, their grins impossibly wide. At the far end, a door waited, red and pulsing as if alive. They crashed through, slamming it shut just as the first mannequin's clawed hand slapped against the wood. The new hallway was different. The carpet was sodden underfoot, and water trickled down the walls, carrying with it flakes of old wallpaper and something darker. The air was thick with the smell of rot and old lake water. Julia shivered. At the end of the hallway, light flickered. Under a heavy door, they pushed it open and found themselves on the shore of a vast, black lake, a place that could not possibly exist beneath the hotel. The water was utterly still, reflecting nothing, absorbing every scrap of light. All around the shoreline, dozens of people in old-fashioned clothing stood motionless, staring at the water, their faces gaunt and hollow. One by one, they turned to look at Julia and Corinne, eyes blank, mouths open in silent warning. A dock jutted out into the water, and at its end, Mark stood, his back to them. Julia's heart soared and broke at the same moment. She called his name, voice trembling. Mark turned, his face pale, eyes deep wells of sorrow. He held out his hand. "Julia, you have to cross," he said. His voice was distant, already fading. "It's the only way. Don't look back. If you look back, you'll never leave." Corinne gripped Julia's arm. "Don't trust him," she whispered. "He's not really here. He's just another piece of this place." But Julia was already walking, feet carrying her down the dock, closer and closer to Mark. The water on either side began to churn, sending up ripples that broke the perfect blackness. Hands reached from below the surface, grasping for her ankles, pulling at her dress. But she kept her eyes on Mark, refusing to look down. The dock seemed to stretch forever. Julia's breath grew ragged. Behind her, Corinne screamed something, was dragging her back toward the shore, skeletal arms wrapped around her waist. Julia reached out for Mark, fingers brushing his. For a moment, she felt warmth, hope, but as she took his hand, Mark's face melted, twisting into a mask of agony and hate. The dock exploded beneath her feet, plunging her into the icy black water. She sank, flailing, lungs burning as the hands from below dragged her deeper, deeper. Through the murk, faces loomed, Corinne's, Mark's, the children from the basement, all warped by sorrow and fear. Just as her strength gave out, a light shone above her, a pinprick, impossibly distant, but growing brighter. Julia kicked, clawed her way upward, desperate for air, for escape, for anything but this suffocating nightmare. The hands released her, and she broke the surface, gasping, dragging herself onto a rocky shore. She was alone. The lake, the dock, the shore gone, as if they had never existed. All around her, the hotel loomed, its walls pulsing with sick yellow light. Julia staggered to her feet, soaked and freezing, and forced herself to move forward, toward whatever waited in the heart of the Moonrise Inn. Julia wandered forward, shivering in the thin nightgown that clung wet and cold to her skin. The air around her buzzed with the faint hum of electricity and a static tension that raised the hairs on her arms. The walls of the Moonrise Inn pressed in from all sides, alive with a restless movement just out of sight, a trick of the corner. Of her eye, a whisper that died on the edge of hearing. Every step she took, the carpet squished with water beneath her feet, leaving behind muddy footprints that faded into nothingness. As she moved through the corridors, she caught glimpses of herself reflected in the warped glass of old portraits. Her face was drawn, gaunt, eyes shadowed with a grief so deep it seemed bottomless. Behind her, in every reflection, other faces flickered, dozens of them, some children, some old, all of them twisted by pain and terror, watching her, following her. Julia averted her gaze, forcing herself not to look too closely. A stairway opened up ahead, spiraling down into the earth. The air turned colder, heavier, and as she descended, the familiar layout of the hotel gave way to a labyrinth of stone tunnels and bricked-over doorways. The walls bled moisture and patches of green-black mold, and the passage narrowed so that Julia was forced to turn sideways, scraping her shoulders on the rough stone. The further she went, the more the hotel structure faded away, replaced by the feeling of something ancient, primal, a darkness that had waited centuries for someone to stumble this far. Somewhere ahead, a voice called her name, not Mark. Not Karen, but her mother, dead for years, her tone warm and coaxing. Julia nearly cried out in longing, but bit her tongue hard enough to taste blood, remembering Karen's warning. The shadows grew deeper. Julia's flashlight had been lost somewhere in the black lake, so she moved by touch, by instinct, by the dull glow that seemed to pulse in the stones themselves. She reached a door unlike any she'd seen before, carved from wood so old it was petrified to stone, marked with runes and names she could not read. Her hand hovered over the handle. From beyond the door came a low, throbbing chant, voices rising and falling in a language that vibrated in Julia's chest, stirring up memories that weren't hers. She steeled herself, turned the handle, and pushed inside. The room was vasta. Cathedral buried beneath the earth. Candles guttered along the walls, their flames blue-white and casting monstrous shadows on the stone. At the center, a circle was drawn in blood and salt, and inside it, a congregation of figures stood robed in midnight cloth, their faces obscured by veils, their hands clasped in prayer. As Julia entered, every hooded head turned to face her, their movements impossibly synchronized. A priest, if he could be called that, stepped forward, robe trailing behind him, the fabric whispering like snakes on stone. His voice was deep and resonant, echoing with centuries of authority and malice. "You have crossed the threshold, Julia," he intoned. "You stand at the heart of your fear, where all souls are weighed and all debts come due." The congregation began to chant again, a sound that filled Julia's skull, threatening to drown her in memories not her own. She staggered to her knees, clutching her head, images flashing behind her eyes, Mark smiling at her in the sunlight, Karen laughing, her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair. Then, darkness, the hotel collapsing, the screams of children, the feeling of hands around her throat. Julia fought to hold on to her sense of self, repeating her own name over and over like a mantra. The priest reached out, pressing a cold hand to her forehead. "You cannot escape," he whispered. "Not until the truth is spoken. Not until you face what you have always feared." The candles flared. The congregation vanished, and Julia was alone in the circle, surrounded by mirrors that rose up from the floor, each one reflecting not her body, but moments of shame, regret, pain. She saw herself as a child, hiding beneath the bed while her parents screamed at each other. As a teenager, turning away from a friend in need. As an adult, closing her eyes to the suffering of others. The visions were relentless, each one a blade turning in her chest. She fell to her knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry." As the words left her lips, the circle shattered, the mirrors dissolving into dust. A door appeared on the far side of the chamber, light pouring from beneath it, and for the first time Julia felt the weight on her chest lift, just a little. She rose unsteadily and walked toward the door, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a fragile hope. She pushed open the door and emerged, blinking, into the lobby of the Moonrise Inn. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows. The storm was gone. The air was fresh and the hotel was empty and quiet. Julia stared around in wonder, hardly daring to believe it. Was it over? Had she escaped? She stepped forward and her footfalls echoed on the polished wood. A bird sang. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a car horn sounded, but even as relief washed over her, Julia sensed something wasn't right. The silence was too deep, the light too clean, the lobby too pristine. There were no signs of Mark, of Karen, of any other living soul. She crossed the room, peering out the window. The street outside was deserted, not a single person in sight. The world seemed paused, as if holding its breath. Julia tried the front door, but it would not open. She pounded on the glass, calling for help, but her voice seemed to vanish before it reached the street. She circled the lobby, searching for any exit, any imperfection in the flawless facade. The mirrors on the wall reflected her, but now her face was calm, composed, utterly emotionless. Behind her, footsteps echoed. She spun, but saw no one. Then the overhead lights flickered. In the center of the lobby, the carpet peeled back, revealing the trapdoor to the basement, wide open, darkness yawning within. From that hole, a single familiar voice rose, Mark's voice, calling for her, pleading for help. Julia stood on the threshold, her mind a battlefield of hope and terror. She knew she should run, should break a window, should scream. But she also knew that whatever lay beneath this hotel, whatever ancient power had claimed it, was not finished with her yet. She took a trembling breath and descended the stairs once more, into the depths of the Moonrise Inn, where the past and future, the living and the dead, waited to be confronted and reckoned with at last. The stairs wound downward in impossible spirals, each step colder than the last, the light fading behind Julia until she was once again swallowed by the gloom of the Moonrise Inn's underbelly. Her hand grazed the wall, searching for support, but the wood felt clammy and pulsed faintly, as if it possessed its own heartbeat. Every breath she drew chilled her lungs, and the silence pressed in thicker, denser, until even her footsteps seemed muffled by the darkness. At the bottom of the staircase, Julia found herself in a corridor she did not remember from before. The air buzzed with static and the scent of old earth, mold, and ancient dust. Faintly luminescent shapes flickered across the walls, moving in patterns that made no sense. Doors lined the corridor on either side, some open to yawning blackness, others tightly shut with rusted chains, each door bearing a different name in faded gold letters: Eleanor Marsh, Henry Wilcox, David Sloan, and so many more, names she recognized. From the elevator, the lost, the claimed. As Julia walked forward, the corridor seemed to breathe, the floor gently rising and falling beneath her feet. From behind the chained doors came faint noises, a child sobbing, a woman singing a lullaby gone sour, a man whispering feverishly, words she couldn't quite catch. She hurried past, heart hammering, feeling the weight of eyes following her. From the other side of the wood and iron. She reached a door that was slightly ajar, the name Karen Foster carved into the tarnished plate. Julia's hands shook as she pushed it open, calling softly. Inside was a small windowless room, lit only by the pale glow of a single flickering bulb. In the center sat Karen, knees hugged to her chest, rocking back and forth. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes wild and lost. At Julia's touch, Karen flinched, then recognition slowly dawned. She reached out, clutching Julia's hand with desperate strength. "I couldn't find you," Karen whispered. "I tried. It kept showing me things, terrible things. My father's funeral. The night I left home. All the pain I ever tried to forget. It said I could stay here forever, safe from the world above, if I just let go." Julia knelt beside her, voice steady despite the tremor in her soul. "We can't stay here. We have to find Mark, and then we get out. No matter what. It shows us." Together they rose, supporting each other as they left the small cell. The corridor beyond seemed to have changed, shifting its length and shape, the doors now pulsing with an angry, red light. The noises from inside grew louder, more insistent cries. For help, threats, promises of comfort, all blurring into a maddening cacophony. At the far end, a set of double doors stood open, spilling a blinding white light into the hallway. Drawn forward, Julia and Karen entered a vast chamber, part ballroom, part cathedral, impossibly grand beneath the ruins above. Hundreds of figures lined the walls, faces hidden behind masks fashioned from bone, wood, and glass. The air was thick with the scent of burning wax, and overhead, hundreds of candles floated without support, their flames flickering in a wind that seemed to come from nowhere. At the center of the chamber, Mark stood atop a dais, flanked by two faceless attendants in black robes. He seemed impossibly still, his eyes unfocused, lips moving in silent prayer. When Julia called out, Mark did not turn. Instead, the massed congregation turned as one, their hollow gazes fixed on the newcomers. A voice boomed from the shadows above, echoing off marble columns. "All who come to the heart must make an offering. All who remain must face the truth of what binds them here." The floor beneath Julia and Karen's feet split and shifted, forming a pattern of concentric circles, each marked with symbols and names. Hers, Karen's marks, the names from the elevator and the corridor. The congregation began to chant, a low rhythmic murmur that reverberated in Julia's bones. Suddenly, Mark looked up, his eyes meeting Julia's for a heartbeat. Something real, something loving flickered there. "You have to break the chain," he whispered. "You have to let go." Julia felt the weight of every regret, every loss, every fear she had ever carried, pressing down upon her. Visions swirled around her, her mother dying in a hospital bed, Mark leaving her in anger after a fight, Karen sobbing alone in the dark. For a moment, the urge to give in was overwhelming. It would be so easy to surrender, to let the pain define her, to become another name on a door. But Karen gripped her hand, eyes blazing with stubborn hope. "Don't let it take you, Julia. Don't let it take any of us." The dais beneath Mark cracked, a darkness oozing up around his feet, tendrils of shadow wrapping his legs, pulling him down. He screamed, his voice splintering into dozens of others, the lost souls of the hotel, all crying out for release. The masked congregation pressed closer, their chanting rising to a fever pitch. Julia threw herself toward the dais, reaching for Mark as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole. For an agonizing instant, their fingers touched, and Julia felt a jolt of warmth, a spark of memory, sunlit afternoons, laughter, hope. She clung to it, refusing to let go. The chamber shook, dust and debris raining from above. The candles snuffed out, plunging everything into a darkness broken only by the faint, defiant glow where Julia and Mark's hands joined. With a desperate cry, Julia pulled, dragging Mark from the grasp of the shadows. Karen joined her, anchoring them to the world of the living. One by one, the masks fell from the faces of the congregation, revealing not monsters, but people, ordinary men, women, children, all marked by suffering, all yearning for peace. Chanting faltered, faded, and then silence fell. The chamber began to collapse, the floor buckling and splitting, the walls dissolving into mist. Julia, Mark, and Karen ran, fleeing through corridors that warped and twisted, chased by the roar of destruction. They burst through a final door and found themselves blinking in the gray light of dawn, standing in the ruins of the Moonrise Inn. The hotel was gone, reduced to ash and stone, the air heavy with the scent of rain and renewal. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Mark took Julia's hand, and Karen laughed, a sound bright and fragile in the morning air. They turned their backs on the ruins and walked away, the weight of their nightmares lifting with every step. But even as they left, Julia glanced back. For just a moment, she thought she saw a child waving from the shadow of the ruins, her face familiar, her eyes full of gratitude. Then the vision faded, and the world was empty but for the three survivors, and the hope of something new beyond. The scars of the past. Days passed, though to Julia it felt like she had stepped outside of time. She, Mark, and Corinne wandered the roads of Maine in silence, drawn northward by instinct more than choice. The landscape was empty in a way it had never been before. Whole towns seemed abandoned, houses left with doors ajar and lights still burning. Inside, as if their inhabitants had vanished in the middle of ordinary life. The radio in Mark's car sputtered static no matter which station he tried. Cell phones glowed uselessly, no signal, no news, no contact with anyone. But each other. At night, they camped by the side of the road or in the ruins of old motels. Always wary, always listening for the faint echo of voices or the strange hush that sometimes settled over the land. Mark hardly slept, pacing the edge of every campfire, eyes scanning the woods. Corinne became withdrawn, staring into the darkness with haunted eyes, as if she could still see the masks and shadows that had nearly claimed her. Julia clung to the small routines of survival, finding food, boiling water, keeping a journal, even as some part of her wondered whether any of it mattered, whether anything would ever be the same. Sometimes, at dusk, Julia glimpsed strange shapes moving on the horizon, groups of people walking together in utter silence, their faces blank, never acknowledging her calls. Other nights she dreamed of the Moonrise Inn, the endless halls, the drowned children, the congregation chanting her name, and always the weight of the hotel pressing down on her chest, threatening to draw her back into the dark. On the fourth night, as they made camp beside the cracked asphalt of an old highway, Karen suddenly rose, her voice brittle. "We have to find answers. We can't keep running. We need to know if we're the only ones left." Mark nodded. "There's a town west of here, Aroostook. It's big enough that someone should be there. If there's any hope, we'll find it there." The next morning they set off, a hush falling over the woods as they drove. The landscape changed as they approached the town, signs of violence and chaos everywhere. Cars left in ditches, windows smashed, graffiti scrawled on every wall. Julia's heart raced as they crossed the bridge into Aroostook. The town square was deserted, but not empty. Personal belongings were scattered everywhere. A child's shoe, a woman's purse, a half-eaten sandwich still sitting on a bench. They parked and ventured down Main Street, calling out. The echo of their voices bounced off empty storefronts. A siren wailed in the distance, then died away. They saw movement, a figure darting behind a row of mailboxes. Mark chased after him, and Julia and Corinne followed, hearts pounding. They found a young man cowering in a narrow alley, clutching a baseball bat, his eyes wide with terror. "Please stay back," he stammered. "You're not real." "You're not." Julia knelt down, hands raised in peace. "We're real. We survived. Something at the Moonrise Inn. What happened here?" The young man looked at them, tears welling in his eyes. "It started all at once. People just vanished. The air got thick, like it was hard to breathe. And the ones who stayed, they started seeing things, shadows, faces, and mirrors. Some just walked into the woods and never came back. My name's Ben. I haven't seen another living soul for days. I don't think we're alone anymore." That night, the group sheltered in the back room of an old bakery. Ben told them more stories. Of neighbors gone mad, of whole families disappearing. "The farther north you went," he said, "the worse the stories became. Some believed it was a sickness. Others that it was a curse, punishment for old sins. Most simply vanished, leaving only a memory and a silence that pressed on every wall." Julia sat awake, watching the moon drift through the clouds. She felt the old dread stirring, the sense that the inn was not truly gone, only sleeping beneath the surface of the world, reaching out through empty towns and silent streets, drawing in anyone left behind. She looked at Karen, at Mark, at Ben, and knew none of them would ever be the same again. As dawn crept in, Julia rose. She felt a resolve she had never known before, a fierce, stubborn hope, burning beneath her fear. "We can't run anymore," she whispered. "If this is everywhere, we have to face it. We have to go north, find the source, and end it. Or at least understand." The others nodded, each lost in their own grief, their own fear, but united now by purpose and the bond of survival. They packed up, stepped outside, and began walking north, toward whatever waited for them in the haunted ruins of America. Behind them, the wind stirred, carrying with it the distant sound of children laughing, a sound both beautiful and unbearably sad, echoing on and on into the dawn. They moved north through empty landscapes where the wild had begun to reclaim what humanity abandoned. Roads were cracked and overgrown, phone lines tangled with vines. At night, fires burned in the forest, sometimes set by desperate survivors, sometimes by something else, their flames sending flickering shadows that danced high against the trees. As days blurred together, the group grew close, each haunted by their own memories of the inn and the things they'd witnessed. Conversation was rare, but when someone spoke, it was always in whispers, as if afraid of waking something sleeping in the world around them. As they passed through the ruins of Presque Isle, Ben led them to a radio tower on a low hill. "I've heard rumors," he said, "that someone's still broadcasting. If there's hope, it's on the airwaves." They climbed to the control room, finding old equipment and a scattering of broken mugs and papers. Julia scanned the dials, her fingers trembling. Static filled the room, but then a voice. Thin, warped by distance and interference, but real. "If you can hear me, you are not alone. We are gathering at Fort Kent. The river is our boundary. The darkness cannot cross running water. Bring what you can. Bring your stories. We will remember you." Mark gripped Julia's arm. Karen cried for the first time since the hotel, the sound raw and aching. It was a sign. They moved fast, scavenging supplies and mapping the way north to Fort Kent, hoping, fearing, clinging to the hope that the world had not ended, only changed. The journey was harder than any of them expected. The further north they traveled, the stranger the world became. The sun hung lower in the sky, sometimes shining green or blue at sunset, sometimes not rising at all for a day or more. They passed small groups of survivors, hollow-eyed and wary, some so broken by loss they could only mutter the same phrases over and over. Julia recognized the haunted look. They too had faced the supernatural terror now seeping through the bones of America. One night, they camped near a ruined church, the stone walls caved in by time or violence. Julia dreamed she stood once more in the ballroom beneath the inn. The massed congregation watched her, their faces shifting and warping as if made of smoke. One mask peeled away, revealing her own face, weeping blood. She woke with a scream, Mark's arms around her, the others watching in silent understanding. "It follows us," Karen said, "until we end it, or it ends us." On the last stretch to Fort Kent, they reached the river. The current was fast and clear, a boundary between worlds. On the far side, fires burned, voices drifted in the cold. Air real people, survivors. But the bridge was gone, washed out by the floods that had ravaged the land months before. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm them, but Ben remembered an old rowboat he'd seen upstream, half buried in reeds. Together, they dragged it free, patching the holes as best they could with old canvas and hope. One by one, they crossed the water, hearts pounding as the darkness pressed in behind them, shapes moving at the forest's edge, eyes shining in the night. On the far shore, the survivors welcomed them with wary relief. They were a ragged, weary band old men, children, mothers, scarred men and women who had refused to give up. Julia learned their stories, of other haunted places, other disappearances, other inns and towns lost to the darkness. Each night, they gathered by the fire and shared memories, keeping the world alive by remembering. For a time it seemed safe. The darkness did not cross the river, and Julia felt the first flickers of peace since leaving the hotel. But some nights, when the wind blew just right, she heard it, laughter, crying, the old voices calling from across the water. She knew then that the Moonrise Inn, or something like it, waited on the other side, patient, hungry, dreaming of the day when all the boundaries would finally fall.